Hello, I'm Mark, and I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be with you all in person this afternoon. I'd like to tell you about some of the research that I've been doing with the Sustainable Uplands project, and most recently with Helen Dunn and her team from DEFRA, who you'll be hearing more from later on this afternoon. With the anticipated contraction in agricultural payments coming from Brussels and growing interest in the big society, there's real interest in whether we could get significant private investment in nature conservation through payments for ecosystem services. I'm going to focus on uplands, where I think we get some of our most important, valuable ecosystem services in this country, and of course where many of our national parks are located. There are already a number of payments being made, some from private investment in upland ecosystem services, and a lot of thought is being put into ways in which we might overcome some of the barriers to enable future payments to be made. I'm going to focus on carbon in particular, but I'll also look at a number of other ecosystem services, including water quality and of particular interest in a national park context, visitor payback. Most of our national parks are located in uplands, providing a huge range of services to society that we all depend upon, but often take for granted. 70% of our drinking water comes from mainly upland catchments. Peat soils, most of which are located in uplands, are Britain's biggest store of carbon, holding more carbon than all the forests of France and Germany combined. If that were to end up in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, that could potentially create a positive feedback to climate change, but healthy peat bogs actually take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and lock it up in the peat, contributing to climate regulation. Our uplands play host to a range of internationally important habitats and species, not to mention outstanding cultural heritage, invaluable recreation opportunities and land-based industries such as hill farming and field sports. But these environments face an uncertain future, with declining agricultural subsidies from Europe and other policy pressures such as the need to get water bodies into good status under the Water Framework Directive, not to mention ongoing climate and demographic change. So in this context, interest is growing in payments for ecosystem services, which I'm defining as a voluntary transaction where a well-defined ecosystem service or land use that's likely to secure that service is being bought by an ecosystem service buyer from an ecosystem service provider, if and only if the ecosystem service provider can actually secure the provision of that service. I think at a time when public money is obviously tight, there is interest in using these sorts of payments to try and get new private investment in nature conservation. But another benefit may be that by paying for things that we value but that are not currently paid for, such as carbon and biodiversity, we might be able to incentivize better management for the fullest range of services rather than just focusing on things like food and fibre. I think there are a number of opportunities for payments for ecosystem services in uplands that it would be worth exploring together. So first of all, climate regulation. Despite being our largest carbon store, we're currently losing carbon from degraded peatlands. Restoration can stem that loss and start absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. Methane emissions are a short-term problem associated with restoration, but there's now widespread academic consensus that over the long term, restoration actually brings a net greenhouse gas benefit. There's also a whole suite of co-benefits associated with restoration. So restored peat bogs are good for upland biodiversity. They reduce fire risk and reduce the likelihood of wildfires burning into the peat, and reduce the sedimentation of fish spawning beds and reservoirs downstream. There's a huge market demand for carbon sequestration and storage through peatland restoration and other forms of land-based carbon sequestration. So BRE, commissioned by Natural England in 2009, estimated that somewhere between 1 and 10 million tonnes of carbon reduction per year could be paid for in this way by companies and by individuals. The companies that they interviewed were more interested in corporate social responsibility than actually having tradable credits that they could sell on international markets. And they were saying that they'd be potentially prepared to pay a premium for UK-based carbon reductions from land-based projects that have co-benefits, for example, biodiversity. But they're saying, obviously, this has to meet rigorous, transparent, recognised standards. In terms of the supply, there are many landowning organisations who want to restore damaged peatlands but simply don't have the means. It's a very expensive thing to do in what are often very remote locations. So these organisations are very keen often to use private investment to pay for the helicopters and other such things. There are a number of intermediaries that exist to put the buyers together with the sellers, and a number of these have expressed an interest in carbon sequestration from peatland restoration. But they're saying that we need cost-effective verification and some kind of accreditation. So the most common form of accreditation that's used in this industry is something like the voluntary carbon standard. But there's lots of barriers to achieving the transactions that we're thinking about here. It may not be possible, for example, to satisfy the sorts of additionality criteria that we would need if we wanted to access voluntary carbon markets. So, for example, if you look at peatland restoration options in rural priorities in Scotland, in the high-level scheme in England, in Gloucester, in Wales, for example, you could argue, well, this might be happening already. What is additional by using voluntary carbon markets? Assessing the compliance markets, which were created under the Kyoto Protocol, would require legislative changes, both at the UK level, and then if we wanted to access the European emissions trading scheme, then at EU level as well. And most people think that's relatively unlikely at this point. And the other barrier is that if we wanted the carbon reductions that have been achieved through restoration to count towards government commitments, either under Kyoto or under its domestic climate legislation, then all of our peatlands would need to be counted in the UK government's greenhouse gas inventory, which is not the case at the moment. So, one way around this might be to think about a corporate social responsibility scheme, which could enable private companies who are interested in becoming carbon neutral, who have done everything they can to reduce emissions at source, to invest in peatland restoration in our upland national parks and elsewhere to achieve that target. How would you do this? Lots of practicalities you need to get around. Could we think about trying to coordinate and integrate with existing schemes? A conservative analysis of this suggests that carbon payments could actually subsidise some of these schemes, perhaps by around 20%, but it all depends on how expensive the restoration is and also how much you get for carbon. And in a best case scenario, you'd potentially completely pay for some of the existing options. If we could get these peatlands into the greenhouse gas inventory, then one of the neat things about taking a corporate social responsibility route rather than a voluntary carbon scheme is that the benefits that you get in terms of carbon can actually count towards legislative targets, because you don't need to leave these for people to be able to trade. So, thinking about how we might be able to achieve this, again, one option may be to adapt the greenhouse gas accounting guidelines, which currently allow companies in the UK who've reduced their emissions at source to become carbon neutral via offsetting from UK-based, land-based projects. So there's been a consultation on a UK forest carbon code as part of these guidelines. I wonder whether it might be worth thinking about a peatland code next. Initial work that's been done suggests that it would be relatively easy to develop the technical, legal, financial and organisational design of such a code. And if you made that consistent with the sorts of requirements that you would need under the voluntary carbon standard, then you leave the route open in future if you do want to turn these into tradable credits. Okay, so that's carbon. What about water quality then? Well, land management, including restoration, can significantly reduce the amount of brown water, dissolved organic carbon, and particular organic carbon, eroded material, coming off our peatlands. Obviously, there are benefits to water companies who currently spend millions of pounds cleaning up that brown water. United Utilities, paid via Ofwat, are already actually paying for water quality through land management in a scheme in the North Pennines. But talking more widely to other water companies, it seems that interest in this is somewhat mixed. It seems to depend on the extent to which water companies have major problems with dissolved organic carbon. Those who don't really aren't that interested in upland type schemes. And it depends on the extent to which these companies perceive that they are likely to have a legal responsibility for not meeting targets under Water Framework Directive, or whether it's going to fall to land managers. Now, if it's up to the land managers to keep the law and ensure that the water that comes off their land is appropriate in terms of keeping water bodies in good status, then why should water companies pay people effectively to keep the law? Regulation of flood risk is a bit more tricky. Now, there is some evidence that restoration can reduce stream peak flow and hence reduce downstream flood risk. But studies show that the effect tends to be quite short-lived, and once the capacity of the soil to store water has been reached, then the restoration hasn't got a huge effect on flood risk. Worst case scenario, depending on where you do the restoration, if you're doing grip blocking, then you can actually exacerbate flood risk downstream through restoration. So mixed evidence on that. Short term, potentially it goes the wrong way. So what about regulation of fire risk? Well, restoration obviously raises the water table level, which in turn should reduce the risk of wildfires burning deep into the peat. And obviously wildfires cost a huge amount of money to put out on an annual basis. So in theory, people may be willing to pay for this to try and reduce the bills that they're paying in helicopters and such like to put out wildfires, but there's no current established market for this. I think probably the best way to market this kind of benefit might be to actually package this together with schemes which are marketed on the basis of carbon and water, where this is basically a co-benefit. Finally then, cultural ecosystem services. These are often very hard to monetize, very difficult to put a pound sign on them, but options are emerging for this. For example, there are a huge range of visitor payback schemes which exist currently across the UK National Park network, from car park schemes through to bed taxes. For example, the scheme in the Lake District, which is raising around £50,000 a year from a £2 accommodation surge charge. Spatial planning approaches may offer us something. For example, Section 106 agreements in England and their equivalent in other devolved administrations, and the Community Infrastructure Levy, which is only now starting to be used, where you've got developers who have to make contributions. Those contributions could be made under these agreements to contribute towards peatland restoration, to get these other co-benefits or other forms of nature conservation in national parks. Habitat banking, I think, is likely to be relatively limited in a national park context and in an upland context, simply because of the amount of land that is designated. And typically, where under things like the Habitat or the Birds Directive, you have to replace land like for like where it is developed, the likelihood of development being given a go-ahead in designated uplands is pretty slim. So I suspect that's relatively minor. So if I can finish by coming back to visitor payback, this is something which currently is relatively small in the bigger scheme of things, but I wonder if it's something which has come of age and whether there might be quite a bright future for something like this. I wonder, can we exploit this new big society agenda to really try and expand visitor payback and people's buy-in to this? And I wonder whether there are new technologies that might be able to add value and make it easier for people to make contributions. And I wonder whether, in light of these potential opportunities, we might be able to achieve economies of scale via some sort of national scheme that yet preserves local distinctiveness and the diversity of different schemes that exist around the country while spreading good practice and such like. One of the things that I've been thinking about is whether we might be able to develop a smartphone app across the UK National Park network for upland national parks in particular that might be able to make this that little bit easier. Okay, perhaps a narrow demographic, but it's a start that I think might help. The idea is to build this around augmented reality walks. So this is like you have as a fighter pilot when you're looking through goggles and it tells you about information about what you're actually seeing. A smartphone app that you can hold up to the landscape that will tell you about the archaeology, about different ecosystem services, the biodiversity, such like, and various points of interest. And whether that might be able to provide people with the added value that gets them to purchase an app with money going to the national parks from the profits, but also then as they download different routes to go and explore, getting prompted to make donations. The initial market research we've done is saying that people are prepared to pay up to £1.99 a time for the app and would like to be prompted for £1 per walk, with the option to increase the amount that they donate. And most people saying that they would indeed donate when walking in a national park using the app. So we're going to put this together for funding with a number of the people in the audience today, looking across the National Park network with a bit of luck. And we'll see what happens with that. Beyond that, as I said, this is quite kind of a narrow demographic to start with. I wonder whether it's possible to think together today about how we might be able to assess the opportunities for scaling up visitor payback across the National Park network. What can be learned by combining our knowledge of what works, where, how, and why, and what could we do to apply those lessons across the country to really try and scale this up and exploit this opportunity. So to conclude, I think that there are huge opportunities for national parks to exploit payments for upland ecosystem services. We're already making payments for water quality, and I think there's a huge potential for payments linked to carbon. There are barriers to this, but I think there are credible, practical ways in which we might be able to overcome those barriers in the relatively short term. I suggested a couple of ways in which we might be able to overcome them, and I'm sure there are many other alternative ways in which we might be able to tackle that particular problem. I think that markets for many cultural ecosystem services are at a relatively early stage of development, but I think that there are huge opportunities in terms of visitor payback for national parks, given the political time that we're in and given technological advances. So it's maybe worth revisiting the scale at which we might be able to exploit visitor payback in future. And I think, to conclude really, there's a real opportunity to bundle ecosystem services. So where we have services which are easy to monetize, such as carbon and water, can we bundle them together with things which are harder to monetize, such as biodiversity and recreational opportunities and such like, so that we can add value to the carbon and water payments and hence actually get payments for these other harder to quantify services. I hope that's been useful. This has been a very hurriedly put together video, but hopefully it's communicated my message. If you've got any questions at all about what I've talked about today, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. My email address is m.reed, R-E-E-D, @abdn.ac.uk. So I'll look forward to hearing from some of you.